to record. So welcome everybody. My name is Sue Grinnell and I'm with the Public Health Institute, and I'm really excited about today to have Jennifer Splansky-Jester and Abigail Stevenson from FSG to really dive in deeper to what a backbone is. I know that a lot of you that are on have been on this journey for the last year and a half, and just as I'm listening to you all, I thought this might be just really a helpful conversation to dive in, and we want this to really be informal and ask lots of questions and, you know, just make sure it's all clear. So Jennifer is with FSG, and she's been there, you know, working over 15 years of social sector leadership experience, including advising foundations, NGOs, and partnerships on issues related to strategy, evaluation, and the design of collective impact initiatives. And Jennifer is in San Francisco. And then Abigail is also with FSG. She's out of the San Francisco office, but she's actually in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And so excited that she's there with a sunny day and no snow. And she has over 10 years of work experience in healthcare and consulting. So I'm going to turn this over to both of them now, and so we can dive in.
Great. I think, Abby, you're going to kick us off.
That sounds great. So here's the agenda. We are so excited to be here. Thanks so much for inviting us. Jen and I, as Sue mentioned, both have worked on collective impact for a number of years and find this to be a really exciting topic and are just really thrilled to learn and share with you all today. As Sue said, we want to keep this informal, but our agenda and things we wanted to discuss are to, one, introduce a little bit about FSG, just so you know our perspective and our experience and where we're coming from. And then second, we wanted to talk about collaborative structure, sort of what are the typical structures we see within collective impact efforts. And then third, go in depth in talking about the role of the backbone specifically, and then talk about some of the collaborative governance, ways of sort of organizing and governing collective impact efforts. And lastly, some of the mindset shifts and other new ways that collective impact calls on us to act. And then we will stop along the way after each major section to do Q&A and have a little bit of a discussion with you all. So to start out with, just wanted to give you a little bit of background on FSG so you know who we are. The first thing to know about FSG is that we're mission driven. We're a nonprofit organization, and we specialize in strategy and evaluation and research for our clients. We were founded in the year 2000 as the Foundation Strategy Group. We're now just FSG. And because we work with not just foundations, but also with corporations on their philanthropic giving, with large nonprofits, and with collaboratives, of course. FSG is an interdisciplinary organization. So in addition to working with various types of clients, we also work across issues. So I help lead our US health practice, but we also have an education practice, global health, economic development, environment. So that really encourages us to take a social determinants of health kind of view about health.
Abigail, sorry, somebody is can you guys all mute yourselves if you're not muted? Sounds like someone's maybe on a phone line or something.
Yeah, that's great. We need a guy.
I think I know who it is there. Okay. Okay, go ahead, sorry.
No problem. Last couple things just to know about FSG. We're a thought leader, which means that as a nonprofit organization, when we have different consulting engagements, we actually go out of our way to share what we've learned in our various different engagements with the field more broadly. That's a big part of how we fulfill our nonprofit mission, is sort of sharing our lessons learned. And lastly, we're global. So we're about a 150-person firm. We have 6 offices, 4 in the US and 2 internationally. And we work both on the ground and then, of course, connecting sort of through thought leadership of those. So that's a little bit about us. And then I think I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to talk about how we work on collective impact.
Sure. So I think Sue mentioned that my role within FSG is as the executive director of the Collective Impact Forum. And what we are is a program that's a partnership between FSG and the Aspen Institute's Forum on Community Solutions. And so I'm thrilled to be with you all today. And just wanted to share this slide that gives a little background on where the content that we'll talk today comes from. And it comes from 3 different ways that we have learned about and supported the field to do cross-sector collaboration most effectively. The first, if you start at the bottom of the triangle, is what I just mentioned, our Learning Community Collective Impact Forum. We have a 25,000 person online membership group and organize multiple conferences and trainings a year that are as much about sharing content with the field as they are about us learning about what's happening across many, many different initiatives in the country. We also, through FSG's consulting work, do hands-on support, very deeply supporting collective impact work. This is the part of the work that Abby is closest to, and she'll draw from some of those examples today. And then Abby already mentioned some of the ways that we do writing and research and publish that to share with the field. So just the broad and the deep perspectives are what we'll draw on for today's session. So without further ado, we wanted to set the stage for focusing today's conversation on the backbone by thinking about the broader structure within which the backbone role sits. And the way that we most like to conceive of collective impact structures are starting with partners, starting with the local ecosystem of people doing work on a specific topic in a community. And so we would illustrate that with each of the little bubbles being a community partner or a business or a nonprofit. You get the gist of it. But there's already, in any collaborative scenario, work happening on the ground in a community. And then as we see these cross-sector collaboratives, we'll probably default to the term collective impact, but draw on our knowledge of many types of collaboratives. We see what we would call like a steering committee or a leadership table coming together that is representative of the range of community partners. And then what we'll focus on today, of course, is the role of the backbone. The backbone being the one that is shepherding the work forward. Often you'll see something like a common agenda, the shared vision for what the work will accomplish that is guided by the backbone and articulated by the steering committee, but really influences the work of the partners that are all coming together. And then we'll often see subgroups taking shape that represent specific pieces of the collaborative. And then the backbone is a really critical piece of ensuring coordination and communication and collaboration so that those work group functions don't get siloed from each other or from the work of the broader initiative as a whole. Just one other thing I want to point out here is that we've labeled kind of co-chairs on each of these work groups, just to remind folks that this is all about distributed leadership across the community. That while we have the backbone that is shepherding the process, there are leaders in every part of this governance. The steering committee certainly is playing a leadership role, but so are those who are guiding work that's happening in subgroups that are really driving forward toward implementation. This is certainly like a stylized version of what things look like in real life. We, of course, know it looks different in every setting. We'll often see other forms of advisory groups present, like a resident advisory group or a funder advisory group or a specific stakeholder group that wants to come together for more coherent input into the initiative. But this, I would say, is kind of a general kind of stylized version of what we often see these collaboratives looking like. Abby, do you want to provide like a specific example that from your work that would bring this to life a little bit? Oh, you're on mute, Abby.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Sure. So one of the examples that I'll use that I think illustrates this is I had the privilege of working with a group of community leaders on the Texas-Mexico border in the Rio Grande Valley area, where they have seen a doubling in the rates of diabetes over the last 15 years. So they're particularly concerned about prevention of type 2 diabetes. And just to give you a flavor of sort of what that looks like, the steering committee consisted of about 25 leaders from different kinds of organizations that touch diabetes in some way. So that included 2 competing hospitals. Their population health folks were on the steering committee. It included a couple of the different FQHC organizations, and their CEOs were participating. It included some researchers from the School of Public Health they have down there that were working on diabetes and doing some community-based work on that. There was the head of the local sort of promotora or community health worker organization. Also some things that are not directly tied to health, but really impact people's ability to handle, to adopt or handle changes in their health, like the community organizing group that had a history of working on immigrant health along the border. They worked with Cesar Chavez. They had really strong roots with the Hispanic community there and were really a trusted partner. So those, the CEO of that organization was also on the steering committee. So a variety of different organizations there. And then they after a few months of sort of forming their common agenda, that was the process of, should we focus on management of diabetes or should we focus on prevention? They decided to focus on prevention. And then they did a whole bunch of landscape research to understand what was the problem with diabetes, which communities were being hardest hit, what were some of the gaps in terms of they found a real big gap in diagnosis rates. About 50% of people in the Valley that have prediabetes don't know it. For instance, and then they did a lot of focus groups and visits with promotoras and things like that. We helped them with this to really identify what were some potential solutions. They were talking with the communities about what were some things that could be done. And from that, they actually came up with the community support, they came up with 200 different ideas of a strategy or something that could be done within this area to address diabetes. They grouped those into about 12 themes, and then they said, let's pick 4 of these to start out with. So they started out with 4 themes of things they wanted to do and made a working group around each one. And those 4 working groups, the first one was around awareness. They knew there was a really big gap in just understanding of diabetes. There was a lot of historical myths that were particular to the area around diabetes, its causes, things like that. Then there was a group around screening, a group around helping match people who are diagnosed as pre-diabetic with lifestyle support programs. They didn't have anything like the diabetes prevention program in the Valley at the time. And then the last one was around integrating care. So really making sure that because diabetes is so often linked with depression and other mental health issues, they wanted to make sure that whether someone presents in mental health services or in the primary care setting, that they were going to be treated and addressed for both. And they thought that was an important part of diabetes for that area. So the working group members consisted of the chairs of the working group. Each working group were actually all steering committee members. In this case, I've seen it in different cases where sometimes the chairs are not involved in the steering committee, or one person is on the steering committee and one other co-chair of a working group is not. But the chairs were from the steering committee, and then they were joined by other sort of doers in the community, people who really had the ability to change how a particular program was run or could really help advance the strategies on the ground. So, for example, I mentioned the immigrant rights group. Their CEO was on the steering committee, but they had their head of programs on one of the working groups to help with screening, because they were trying to introduce screenings in some of the community markets where people could get free diabetes screening. So those were some of the people involved in the steering committee, and then the working group. And the backbone, one of the things we'll talk about is sort of how backbones are appointed or come to be backbones. But in this case, the backbone was originally played by some of the foundation. There was a foundation that supported this effort, and some of their staff, with the support of FSG in this case, were the original backbone. And that was a temporary phase until they really figured out what they were going to need. They knew that in the long term, they really wanted a local organization to be the backbone. So then they eventually had an open process to select a backbone. And the backbone applicant that was chosen was actually a partnership between the community health worker organization, it was a religious-based organization, and the School of Public Health, where they decided to jointly sort of own the backbone function. And so that they played that, and they each offered different sort of specialties. The community health worker organization offered a lot of trust and connection with the community, and then the public health organization offered a lot of the help and support around measurement. in particular and research. So that was how that particular organization was configured.
Awesome. Thank you, Abby. Super helpful to have the broad brush before we dive deeper into the backbone. And for those that might have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. But as Abby said, we have a couple different pause points for Q&A and conversation as we go. So we just included this following slide. So Sue will have these slides to share after if you want them. This is just kind of a written out version of what we just talked through for your reference. So let's talk a little bit more about the backbone itself. So as Abby alluded to, there are of course different roles that we see the backbone fulfilling in different cases. And through the conversations that we have had with a broad range of these types of collaboratives, they tend to fall into roughly 6 different functions that are outlined here. So I'll spend a few minutes talking about each of these. So the first is guiding the vision and strategy. So not necessarily independently setting the vision and strategy, but we're very intentional about choosing the term guide here because the backbone is really responsible for shepherding the group through the process, whoever is part of your collaborative with community input to identify the key priorities that the collaborative will be focused on achieving and making progress on. That often includes, as Abby said, a process up front of understanding the landscape more deeply and understanding root causes more deeply before thinking about what kind of work the collaborative can take on together. So the second one, and these are somewhat sequential, tends to be supporting aligned activities. And so this is ensuring that what we might call the mutually reinforcing activities or the work that takes place in service of pursuing that vision and strategy is coordinated across the broad portion of the collaborative. And so that can include coordinating across different partners' work or across different work groups. It can be having kind of like a strategic lens towards gaps in what's happening and trying to encourage those gaps to be filled. It can be providing technical assistance or coaching on areas that the backbone might have some expertise in, but some partners need to build their expertise around. And it really is looking across the landscape and ensuring that gaps are addressed and that duplication is reduced and that work comes together in service of the common agenda. It doesn't necessarily mean actually doing the work itself, but rather facilitating or helping bring together those that ought to be engaged to move the work forward. So the third one that we talk about is establishing shared measurement practices. And this shared measurement is a term that we use when we talk specifically about collective impact type initiatives. But this is really ensuring that the group is using data to support learning about the opportunity or the issue that's being addressed, as well as the progress that's being contributed to by the collaborative. And it can be a very helpful role for the backbone to play, to be the one that is ensuring that the data is being brought to the conversation. Sometimes the backbone will be doing that data collection itself and the analysis and the presentation of the data. Sometimes the backbone will partner with another organization that might have deeper expertise on evaluation and data. But having the backbone think about and prioritize informing the work with data is something that collaboratives who do this have found really, really valuable. Okay, the fourth thing that we call the backbone function here is cultivating community engagement and ownership. And so this is intended to say that this work of these collaboratives does not just happen amongst formal system leaders in a vacuum, but that community members, residents, individuals with lived experience are engaged in the process. And I know that in talking with Sue, this is something that you all have been talking quite a bit about. And as the backbone, I would actually liken this to shared measurement, where in some cases, this is a very strong capacity of the backbone to do this work yourself. And in some cases, it might be better for a community partner to be the one that is doing a lot of that community outreach and engagement, given the relationships and the skills and the expertise that they have. But as the backbone, it is essential that you as the backbone ensure that work is happening. So whether that is happening through a partner or happening in-house at the backbone, to kind of bring the community perspective in, it is the backbone's responsibility to ensure that this happens. So the fifth one here is advancing policy. We often see this once initiatives are more mature and have sometimes come together around a policy agenda, either based on the work that the collaborative has done, surfacing promising practices that warrant some policy and advocacy to advance, or pursuing policy change that might be required to reduce barriers that are facing some of the work that you're prioritizing. But having a lens towards policy is another role that the backbone can play. And then finally, mobilizing resources. And this is not intended to refer only to resources to support the backbone infrastructure itself, but to mobilize resources on behalf of the work that the collaborative is taking on. So again, with the backbone having that big picture view of all of the work that's happening, the backbone can keep its eye out for funding opportunities that would be helpful to advance the strategies and the programs that the collaborative has identified as priorities to take on. We have stories of backbones applying for federal grants that would never have been attainable if a single organization applied, but when applying as a collaborative and having the backbone be able to kind of quickly pull partners into an application, bringing $40 million into a community to support the work. The example I'm talking about specifically was from the education sector, but I use it as a really powerful example of the way that the backbone can identify opportunities that require a broad set of partners to come together and be poised to capitalize on those types of opportunities. I think what's important to mention, I've used the word kind of ensure or shepherd a number of times, is that these are all things that the backbone has its eye towards ensuring happening, but isn't necessarily always doing all of the work itself, but kind of mobilizing partners to make sure that all of these different pieces happen as appropriate for the work that is unfolding. Abby, is there anything that you want to add here, or Sue, anything that you want to add? This is kind of a linchpin of the key functions of the backbone.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Sue.
Well, I was just going to say, this is really helpful. It's very concrete, very succinct. And I think you said it a couple of times, like it doesn't mean you're doing all of it, that maybe you're better at some things than another. I loved what you just said about poised to capitalize on opportunities. I think just being really clear, like where it is that you're trying to go. So when those opportunities come along, maybe having a process to figure out, is that opportunity right for us, and like who should be doing it, I think is just a really great statement. So thank you.
0. This meeting ID does not exist.
Yeah, and I really like that phrase too, poised to connect others. And I think one of the things I've seen is it's really neat when you see like a really gifted backbone person or staff or someone who really has this in their bones, because I think they end up looking a little bit like a bit of an air traffic controller, where they're not flying the planes, they're not doing it themselves, but they're really helping connect and make sure people don't crash into each other is a lot of what they're doing. So a couple of examples just from that same initiative I was talking about that was working on diabetes prevention. So one of the things that they've been able to achieve is that they went from having no places where someone who had prediabetes could go to a program and participate in it. And as probably all of you know on the phone, the diabetes prevention program is a CDC developed and tested lifestyle support program that's more effective than basically any medication we have on the market. And that was just not available. And they didn't even have something like the YMCA that could readily pick up and do the DPP as they have in other communities. So they now have the DPP, the Diabetes Prevention Program, operating in 9 different parts of the county. And the way they do that is they have the organization that, first of all, the groups have to meet somewhere, and they meet in the Methodist churches. And the reason they meet there is because the Methodist churches had space and could provide it, and we're happy to do that. But they don't actually, the Methodist nurses aren't actually trained in doing the DPP program. So the instructors, if you go to the church for one of these programs, are the community health workers who are bilingual and who work for a different organization. And then the people who show up at those meetings are actually referred by the FQHCs. So there's 3 different organizations that are playing different roles to make those diabetes prevention programs actually go. And the backbone is not running the programs. They're not the instructor of them. They're not hosting them. They're simply, they're really the coordinating function that helps sort of see, these are the resources that each organization can bring to the table to make the diabetes prevention program happen. Or another, I think, example of what they could do in that sort of air traffic controller viewpoint is about mobilizing resources. So one day there was a steering committee meeting, and one of the steering committee members mentioned that there was a new state opportunity for some grants around diabetes prevention. And they said, you know, our organization is actually at our max right now. We don't have the capacity to write a grant. We don't have the capacity to get a grant right now. We're just telling everybody else that there is this grant opportunity in case you want to apply. So the backbone staff helped sort of follow up from that and ask if anyone from the steering committee might want to apply. And it turned out that 3 different organizations were thinking about applying. And so the backbone staff told them, you 3 are all interested in applying for this grant. And so they talked about it together and decided that they were going to apply as one grantee collectively. And then the backbone organization provided them some data and some items from their common agenda that they could pull, some like text that was really easy to describe the problem of diabetes in their area and things like that. So they just helped facilitate and nudge them along, but they actually didn't write the grant. The 3 organizations that were part of the steering committee actually wrote it. When they had it written, the backbone leaders actually said, you know, something else you might want to do is ask for other members' support of this. So they actually had all the other steering committee members sign on in support, saying, if these organizations get this money from the state, we all support them and think they are a great partner to be the fundee of the state. So that was another example where the backbone isn't actually applying, didn't even in this case find the opportunity to apply. They are simply the ones that were, as Jen said, poised to respond and help make sure that there was a coordinated response among the different steering committee members who were involved.
Great, thanks, Abby. Those are awesome examples. So I am going to flip over to a video of a backbone leader talking about their role. So bear with me as I navigate my screen sharing. And let's see how this works. All right. Okay, I think you all can now see the video. So just to frame this up, I'm going to share some short clips from 2 different backbone leaders talking about their work. This first one, Ross Meyer, is from Partners for a Competitive Workforce, an initiative in Cincinnati. The backbone in this case where Ross works is the local United Way, but his role is not one of United Way staff. He is full-time dedicated to guiding this workforce development collaborative. So we're just going to hear from Ross for about a minute about his role.
And that strategy, as a backbone organization, we kind of think of our role as being the gas and the glue. So in one regard, we're here to help accelerate the efforts, accelerate the collaboration so that we can go farther faster. Again, there's a lot of good things happening in our community. Our role is to really pump leadership, resources, and support into making those go farther and faster. But we're also the glue. So we are the backbone to hold all of these efforts together. Partners for a Competitive Workforce is a very lean organization. We've never exceeded more than 2.5 staff. We have about $1 million a year budget. Most of that is invested directly in our initiatives and our partners. This kind of work takes cross-sector funding streams to really pull off the kind of outcomes that we've been able to achieve, and we've been able to maximize limited public resources and limited philanthropic resources by really working together in a aligned fashion.
So that is one, and then I'm also going to play another video. Let's see if I have this one ready. Okay, this is Shakima Townsend-Fulmore from Project U-Turn in Philadelphia.
As the backbone leader, it is really important to share with your partners every aspect of the work. We truly believe in collaboration. We believe in the collective impact approach, and it's the cornerstone of how we operate. So it's certainly not just things that we talk about, it's things that we live as an organization. And that means being willing to understand your expertise and value, and also really being clear about everyone else's expertise and value, and willing to let whoever is the best at it be first. And move the work. And that's something that we do, unashamedly and sort of like breathing. It's natural for us to think about who is best positioned, who has the best skills. And that's our role. Our role is to identify the expertise and uplift it and coordinate it and move towards the common goal.
Great. So the reason I like those is because I think both of those leaders really demonstrate the way that their organizations are conceiving of the backbone role to be the guide, the shepherd, the coordinator, as Ross says, the gas and the glue that then enables other partners to shine and to do their work. So I'm going to manage to get us back over to our PowerPoint. Let's see. Okay. Abby, am I in PowerPoint?
Yes, you're back in PowerPoint. Looks good.
Thank you. I would encourage you all, if you have an opportunity, to spend a little bit of time looking at some of other videos that we have on the Collective Impact Forum website or on FSG's website, because I think we have about 8 to 10 different leaders talking about their role, and they all have different nuances to how they conceive of and implement the role of the backbone that are just really share different insights based on their own work. So also included as a reference in this presentation is a slide that I think Sue might have made available to you all previously, just a friendly reminder of these backbone effectiveness indicators. And these certainly are not a prescriptive set of evaluative indicators, but I do think provide some concrete examples of the kind of work that it takes to live into each of these 6 different roles of the backbone. Another thing that I will just say is I know backbones that have used this, some of these or some subset of these indicators to get feedback from partners. So they'll create like an easy survey that they hand out to members of their leadership table or their partners to ask for feedback on the extent to which they are living into playing these different roles. So it can also be a tool that you use for some either formal or informal feedback from partners along these lines. All right. So
can I just add one thing there, Jen?
Please.
One of the things we often hear from folks who are involved in collective impact efforts is, how can we see progress on our outcomes? We know we're working on something like diabetes, where the diabetes rates aren't going to drop, within 2, 3, maybe not even 5. It might take 10 years to really see it drop in publicly available data. And so one of the big questions and challenges is, how do you sustain momentum and see if you're on track to make progress? And so a lot of the things in the early years that you can look at are things like, is there alignment around a common agenda? Do people have the same vision for what can happen in their community? Is there a backbone? Is that backbone functioning in the ways that people that it should be, is it providing the kinds of services to the working groups and steering committee. So that that survey that Jen was just referring to and those characteristics is a really nice way of being able to actually collect some data and evaluate progress before those publicly available population health measures are online.
Great, thank you, Abby. Super helpful. The next thing I just wanted to say was I loved, Abby, your analogy to the air traffic control. Some other metaphors that we often hear folks using when they describe the backbone are the quarterback. So you're not in the end zone, but you're handing it off and you're passing and you're coordinating, that they're working behind the scenes. I like umbrella, so the bridge. So the context, of course, are all going to be different. But I like thinking about these metaphors and thinking about the role that the backbone plays vis-a-vis many of the other partners. And so we just heard from some of our leaders. As I mentioned, there are a number of different videos online. Susan Dawson and Kat Allen are two others that I would recommend checking out if you are interested. Okay, Abby, over to you.
So we just wanted to sort of conclude this part with a couple of our highlights of successful backbones, some things we see and some of the misperceptions that we see of backbones. So in terms of things that successful backbones really have in common from what we've seen, one is that they have a high level of credibility within the community. That's sort of a baseline and really important. The second one is that they serve as neutral conveners. And I have to say, I often wrestle with the word neutral because neutral doesn't mean that they're passive. It means that they're actually pretty ferocious advocates for community progress. Neutral means that they are not advocating any particular organization's agenda or any particular sector. That's what neutral means. They're sort of there to facilitate all of the different parties who are involved. Most of the time we do see that backbones who are successful have dedicated staff. We know that's hard to do, but in the cases where organizations don't have dedicated staff, that goes back to what Jen was saying about distributed leadership, that even though the backbone is providing a coordination function, they're not the only people leading a particular effort. The steering committee, particularly the co-chairs of the steering committee, they are not part of the backbone. They have a huge role to play in leadership of these efforts, as well as the co-chairs and members of the working groups are all playing roles. So that distributed leadership becomes even more important if you don't have dedicated staff. They build key relationships across the initiative. They focus people's attention and they really get a sense of urgency. They're the ones that are sort of they a little bit like are the people in the community that have their hair on fire. And if anyone mentions something about, say, diabetes happening, they're like, oh, you have to talk to the backbone lead. They really are connected and plugged into all the different people working on diabetes in the area. Another one, they use evaluation as a tool for learning and progress. So that's things like the backbone would do surveys, for instance, of the steering committee and of the working groups of what they're learning, what they're doing, what resources they need, et cetera. And lastly, they stay behind the scenes to establish collective ownership. So oftentimes when I see if there's a public meeting, like a town hall about a collective impact effort, it's very often not the backbone that's even backbone staff that are even speaking. It's very often the co-chairs of the steering committee or the working group. So that, and the backbone staff you might see coordinating the event, and everyone make sure, making sure that everyone knows their role and what they're talking about and who's next. That tends to be sort of what backbones tend to do. On the flip side, we wanted to share a couple of thoughts about things that we see that are often misperceptions or that people learn along the way or change. One is, I think it's pretty common to feel that maybe the backbone gets to sort of owns the initiative and gets to set the agenda or gets to pick or drive what solutions will happen for the group. And those are actually really important that the backbone not do that. Those decisions about, what are our priorities? What are our working groups going to do? What is our particular strategy for screening? I think some of what makes collective impact interesting and powerful is that those decisions are actually made by the people who are closest to the work, and they're made in, it's a collaborative decision among a steering committee or a working group, not any particular agency or organization. So that decision-making power actually lies within the steering committee and the working groups in really good collective impact efforts, not within the backbone. Another misperception is that they receive all the funding. I shared earlier how a backbone might actually play a role in helping members or organizations who are participating in a collective impact effort get funded. Last one is that they're usually not self-appointed, or if they are, there's a lot of care taken to address that. In that collective impact initiative I mentioned, there was a funder who actually served as the initial sort of catalyst for getting things going and served as a little bit of a temporary backbone. But then about 8 months in, they realized that, it was time to actually select and figure out who was going to be the backbone leader for the organization more longer term. And so they did an open call, an RFP essentially, for backbone organizations, and anyone could apply. And the full steering committee nominated, interviewed, and voted on who the backbone organization would be. And I think that really helps increase the credibility of the backbone organization to be selected or at least confirmed by the community. And that's something that's not uncommon, that 6 or 12 or 18 months into an initiative, it might be worth looking at and saying, is the organization that started as the backbone the right organization to continue? Because the needs might be different sort of going forward. And in some cases we've seen an open process, say a year in to select a backbone, and the original organization that was doing it was selected. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a transfer of who's doing the backbone, but at least if there was sort of a self-appointed backbone, it can be helpful to the credibility of that organization to open it up as a question for the community and members and organizations that are involved to say whether or not that's the correct backbone for them. It's not business as usual. So it's quite difficult for an organization to continue with the same staffing, the same responsibilities, the same roles, and also take on a backbone organization function. It really is a different way of working and a different kind of work. And I think one of the things that I've noticed, especially within the collective impact efforts oriented around health, is that there can be a real cultural shift in terms of I think folks operating sort of within, like, say, when a hospital or a FQHC is the backbone, healthcare tends to be pretty regulated and pretty risk averse, and working in sort of a collaborative way is much more adaptive. It's more emergent. It's just a different kind of way of working. We'll talk about a little bit more about that at the end, but I think those are some of the big differences that we notice are the lessons learned about backbones.
Great, thanks, Abby. The last slide here before we take a good pause for Q&A, I'll just bring it all up, is thinking about how backbones can effectively influence without being in a position of formal authority. And I suspect that you might often be asking yourself, okay, how do we actually make this happen, given we actually don't have authority over our partners to mandate this kind of change, this kind of work happening. And in conversations with with a range of backbone leaders who have been effective in this way, we sort of synthesized what we heard from them into these 6 different sources of influence, if you will, that help the backbones really guide the work without a formal authority. And I won't go into detail on all of these. There's some text here, and there's actually a blog series if you're interested that I can send a link to. But a few that I just want to spend a couple minutes on. So the first one that I want to spend a few minutes on is the honest broker. So Abby said that she tends to not love calling the backbone neutral, and I think that's great. We should probably change the language on that slide, Abby. It's my slide, so I will own that. But the honest broker is something that is a term I think might actually more accurately capture what you were talking about, Abby. So you really can gain credibility and influence by demonstrating that honest broker role versus wearing the hat of a single organization. I think another one is being seen as a source of really important data and information, and using that data and information to persuade and to influence. And that can be quantitative data on population data or data on the programs that are happening, but it can also be qualitative data, data of stories and really what's happening on the ground. And so thinking holistically about the kind of data that you can use to really influence can be powerful. And then the power of being a network leader. So number 5 here, really the power of knowing what's happening on the issue, with whom, across where. I think the backbone has a unique ability to have visibility into this across the community better than perhaps anybody else. And that can be a real source of influence and power to broker those connections, to be seen as really a central node in the network. Okay, with that, I definitely want to pause here for some discussion and questions, either questions on some of the content or scenarios that you want to pose to us. Happy to take those now, and then we have kind of another set of content that we'll walk through as well, with another pause for questions after. And Sue, is it better for people to take themselves off mute or to use the chat, or what are your—
Sure, whatever. Yeah, speak up, please. Yes. Sue, are you, for some reason I can't hear you. She's going to call in, I think. I think I just read her lips.
Impressive.
I still can't hear you. So I think she's going to call in. Others on this first part, anything new, validating, surprising? Love to hear from y'all.
This is Heather, and I just wanted to say I really appreciate this this walking through these details and kind of how the backbone organization establishes itself and shares power across the collaborative. We're really a lot of this right now, so it's very exciting. One thing I wanted to ask was about potentially having funding flow from the various partner agencies to support some of that backbone activity. It is challenging as you move into the work to establish those relationships of who's going to take responsibility for what. But at the end of the day, the backbone organization really does hold the weight of making sure things happen. And as other agencies, as their staffing may change, the work will always flow back to the backbone organization to kind of catch up and make sure the collaborative continues. So have you seen models of how there might be funding flows from the partner agencies back to the backbone organization to support that role?
Yeah, great question. And I think we've seen a broad range of funding models for the backbone. And so as I understand it, Heather, you're asking about whether or situations when partners are actually contributing to a pool that supports the backbone function.
There's that, and then there's also, we're looking at so many different models right now. We're looking at direct funding. We're looking at shared pieces of grants received by partner organizations, where we would be a subcontractor potentially to do a small piece of their work, them covering some of our FTE through their own kind of personnel and salaries, just a bunch of different things we're looking at. So I was kind of, walk me through maybe a little bit of what you've seen and things that have proven more robust.
Yeah, so I think that's it's something we actually don't see as often, where the partners are funding the backbone. I will say more typically what we see, which has sustainability challenges, are kind of third-party philanthropic funds or public sector funds funding the backbone. The rationale being that it does not put the backbone in competition or conflict from a mission perspective with its partners. That said, of course, the flip side is the sustainability challenge that comes along with the backbone having to constantly raise philanthropic funds to support its work. And so I think the creative ways that you're talking about are kind of mitigate that. The caution or the thing to be most mindful of, as I'm sure you gathered from our presentation, is trying to find a way that the backbone does not become simply an extension of the organization. If there's a dominant organization providing funding, that it is not in reality or perceived to be simply acting on behalf of a single organization. So I think there's a lot both kind of on paper around grant or funding agreements that you can use to make that clear. But there's also demonstrating that the backbone through your actions is not simply a mouthpiece for one or a small subset of the organizations. And so those are a few reflections that come to mind listening. I think it had, there's certainly a lot of benefits to that approach, though, from gathering funding from a broader range of sources. Abby, what were you thinking about?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, Heather, the number one thing I love about the different models you're exploring is that you're looking at different ways to have multiple funding sources. And I think the one thing that keeps me up most at night thinking about backbone funding is when there's just one funder. Because that, I've seen foundations who swear they're going to fund for 5 years, and then the CEO changes over and they want to take a new approach to change. And it's so painful for the community and everyone involved if a backbone all of a sudden loses funding. And so I love the creativity you're applying in terms of the multiple sources and sort of braiding funding. And as Jen said, really, there's no one source for backbone funding. It can be state funding, it can be philanthropic funding. We've seen corporations put money in, so various different things. I too have not seen every member of the and every member of, say, the steering committee pitch in. I think a lot of the organizations probably might not be in a position to do that. But I like the ethos of it. And if you can make that work with your partners, I think that could be really exciting. And I'd love to sort of hear about that and learn from it.
Yeah, thank you so much for that response. And that definitely dovetails with, I think, how the collaborative started, but we're entering a new phase and we're trying to just explore different options. And what we ultimately want to do is provide a range of options for our partners to support the work, so that it's not always, give us a cash in hand, but can you contribute in other ways? We think that it's important to ensure that there is this shared leadership model, because if we have all the funding and all the responsibility, ultimately we're going to be making a lot of decisions on our own potentially, and it's just not as equitably shared. And then I think we also see scope creep with the interests of the collaborative growing over time, and is the funding available? So if people are really contributing to the funding model, then I think we're doing a shared decision to grow scope, as opposed to just trying to put more responsibility back on the backbone organization saying, hey, this is all such great stuff. Why don't you want to do it? It's certainly not that we don't want to do it. It's just hard with, funding limitations. So like I say, I appreciate the response.
And Heather, where are you based?
Based outside of Los Angeles in Boyle Heights. We're with the Boyle Heights Accountable Community for Health.
Great. Someone else, I think, was trying to.
I think Sue.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
So Heather asked my question. So I really appreciate that and hearing from Heather. I think I'm going to have to touch base with you, Heather, because I'm in that position right now where we're trying to look for funding opportunities through our partners. And I'm kind of looking at the same type of thing where we offer a range of options. And I've had some meetings with some of our partners and potential funders, like what would you be interested in? And it looks like we might have to look at some sponsorships, some pay our services for fee for services, and maybe just some smaller partner contributions. But yeah, I think this thing about getting grant funding, it seems like a lot of the grantors right now want you to be part of a cohort, kind of like we are with CATCHI. And so if you take on a grant like that, then there's a lot more involvement, and you kind of have to follow the structure and the expectations of those funders. And so balancing that is always, we're taking that into consideration as we look at grants that come across our plate, because we only have so much capacity. I think the idea of getting our partners to work together on a grant, and then somehow we add some value and maybe get a piece of that pie, is a good way to go. But I just have to get to that point and figure out how to get there. But I think we're doing a good job in the last 2 years with the funding that we've had to build a credible base and to be some of these backbone things that you showed, and to gain the trust of the community and saying, okay, they're worthwhile investing in, and then to be able to articulate that when we approach them Jesse's been really helpful and important in doing that and helping us do that.
Thanks, Sue. One other thing that your comments made me think of, I'm not sure if Abby and I explicitly said this, but often I talk about the backbone being the facilitator, the shepherd, but not actually doing the work. But I want to say that I have heard some backbones have found it actually a helpful sustainability strategy to also take on some work that is core to the progress of the collaborative that is actually best performed by someone that has that bird's eye view or that broad perspective or that coordinating role, and then actually seeking funding for that specific, more programmatic work that can help cover the time that is harder often to raise funds for, the coordination and the process, if you will. And one of the kind of cautions that I sometimes hear, or not cautions, pieces of guidance that those backbones provide is that they have on multiple occasions, I've heard them talk about having like a committee that is like a subset of their leadership table that they run those kind of opportunities by and get the blessing of the collaborative to play that role so that they don't step on toes of any of the partners in the collaborative, and that they don't cannibalize funding opportunities from their partners, but rather check with their partners that in fact that is something that the backbone is best positioned to do, and almost get like the blessing of the partners to do that. And so depending on how you all have lived into that backbone role, I know for some backbones that's a shift because they've been very pure in saying we don't do programmatic work, but sometimes they actually are the right folks to do it, and doing it responsibly with clear expectations can be also great from an impact perspective and from a funding perspective.
I'm glad you said that, because that's where because we have a couple of sites that actually are kind of playing kind of a dual role where maybe they do offer some kind of program, right? And there's funding for that. And that program, for example, you use diabetes, and maybe they're supporting DPP. So, and that comes out in the community as being something of importance, but they're also serving as a backbone, right? So I've seen kind of where, and I think your point around making kind of the boundaries, right? Because it could get blurry, I think is important. So.
Yeah.
And that happened with us this year, in that we got a contract from the Department of Public Health to do a needs assessment to complement the hospitals. So we're working with our fiscal agent who does a lot of community engagement, and we've been contracted. We have like a $220,000 contract to do that this year. And so unfortunately it doesn't fund a lot of our staffing because we had to hire other people to do a deep community engagement, and connect with our large county across the board. But we're learning, and if we do more of these, we can make sure we write that in.
Yeah. Great.
And that work, Sue, as we've talked about, provides such a great foundation if you're doing that community health assessment with your partners to for other work, right? So other needs. So great.
Any other questions or comments here before we keep going?
I'll add one thing on the funding that might be helpful. I'm not sure if this is relevant to the communities that you're operating in, but another thing that's sort of an interesting consideration is sort of shared backbone functions. So in a couple of different communities we've worked in, they have had multiple collaborative efforts going on at the same time. Like sometimes there's multiple health ones, like there's an asthma one and a dental care one, or even different topics. And they find that backbone function, like an education one and a health one, that backbone function actually has a lot of the same skills that they need. And in some cases, the staff can actually support two different, say they're great facilitators and they facilitate working group meetings really beautifully. That staff can, in some cases, work for two different organizations. So that's just another way I've seen some backbones sort of spread out their staffing costs, is to actually have a larger organization that is pooled and serves multiple efforts.
Thanks, Abby.
Hi, this is Patty. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Patty.
Hi, I do have a question, and I just want to say I think this is really great. This has been, I think it's sort of, we see ourselves, reflected in this many ways, and, with also some of the misconceptions, about not driving sort of the agenda and all that. It's like, oh, we're guilty of that, and I know that we are sort of trying to head in a direction now with our chair and co-chair to sort of share that, driving the agenda and being so backbone driven. But my question was around, at one slide it mentioned the backbone sort of providing technical assistance or being kind of content experts. Should that be around the area of the shared purpose of our ACH, or just in any sort of field that is valuable to the initiative, provide that sort of expert lens?
Great question. I'm happy to take a stab, and Abby, curious for your perspectives as well. I think of kind of two categories. So what I would say is the TA that I think the backbone is best positioned, or I guess most important position to provide, is around the use of data. So the ability to collect meaningful data that helps the collaborative. And around some of the so I would say that kind of TA more so than content specific expertise, because the content specific expertise I think can come from any third party, but the pieces that are related more to the elements of the collaborative would be those that are more helpful and relevant for the backbone to be able to provide. Abby, what would you add?
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think content expertise certainly can help bring credibility and relationships and, being part of the scene. But from a skill set, I think it's more like the facilitation, the use of data, the effective network brokering and weaving that are, I would say, more important for the backbone to have and to own than the content specific when it comes to the specific social issue you're working on.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Let's keep moving, and as I said, we'll hold some questions at the end. I think I'm going to move a little bit more quickly through the next set of slides to make sure that we have more time for a conversation at the end, though. Okay, let me get my screen working again. Okay. So when it comes to the collaborative governance, I think there are certain dimensions that we just want to name as helpful for people to consider. And I think there are governance considerations related to the people. So who is in leadership? How are we staffing this? What kind of, the things we're mostly just talking about, what are members going to be motivated by? How do we have relationships? But that I want to just use the slide to say that it's also important, and I think you all actually are already thinking about elements of the process as well. So what is our financial capacity and our sustainability plan? How are we thinking about resourcing this work? How are we thinking about, who is facilitating and guiding the process? And so there's not a formula, or this is not a checklist, but just to say that when it comes to governance, groups often tend to think about one of the columns more than the other, but that it's important to think about both of these dimensions as you're structuring and putting processes and procedures in place for the collaborative. And that there are a certain number of different dimensions where it's helpful to come to a shared agreement amongst the partners. And some of these are, I think, more obvious than others. So it's super helpful to come to a shared articulation. I think this is part of the CACHI process of what is it that we as a collaborative are coming together to address. You'd be surprised how many collaboratives come together. And if you ask 10 people on a steering committee, what are you here to do? You get 10 different answers. But that's a problem if you're going to actually coalesce around a future direction. So really actually having a shared common understanding of what you're here to do together. and that you can articulate why you need to work together as a collaborative to do so. Some of the other elements where it's helpful to come to a shared understanding is, again, like, how are we going to work together? What is our structure? What are our decision-making norms? What is a shared understanding of the problem or the information that we are using to inform the strategic direction that we're taking? So, this maybe is out of order because you would probably want to have that shared understanding of the problem before you set the goal for what it is that you want to be addressing. But again, not skipping over the fact that you want people to have, it doesn't mean that they all represent the same part of the solution, but they all share the breadth of contributions of the root causes and the problem to inform the direction that the collaborative moves. And then as you're starting to move towards potential action or strategies or system change work that you're going to pursue together, that you are concrete about what that is and have a shared agreement. So this doesn't mean, everyone's signing on the dotted line amongst all these things, but that these are all addressed and that the backbone as the facilitator is getting the group towards a shared understanding and agreement along these different dimensions. A lot of groups that we've worked with have found it very helpful to have shared guiding principles that undergird the work that they take on. And this can be a mix of agreement to how the group is going to work together, includes how the group is going to perhaps communicate externally, principles to guide how the group prioritizes the work that it takes on. But coming to some of those, or articulating some of those shared principles can be super helpful to guiding the work of the collaborative. I want to pause here, Abby, and see if you want to add any examples either from the diabetes work or other work here.
Yeah. I think that having a set of guiding principles can be really helpful because it sort of says, this is our DNA, this is who we are and how we're going to do the work that we do. And I think it'd be a really nice place to sort of reinforce and remind the group about how, like, shared values essentially throughout the process. So for instance, the group I was mentioning that worked on diabetes there, that's the poorest and fastest growing metropolitan area in the United States. So they have had a real history of a lot of people sort of coming in, saying they're going to be really helpful, designing some sort of initiative and starting it and then leaving. The community is not involved. It falls apart. No one knows why. They just have a really, really hard history around this. And they're people referring to them as like los pobrecitos del valle, like the poor little people of the valley. There's a lot of that kind of sort of charity work done to those people instead of with them. So with that in mind, there was a real emphasis on this first one, transparency and accountability, and making sure that it was always clear sort of what decisions were being made and what power structures were sort of operating. Just things like, who gets on a steering committee. When there was like new people added, it was never done like, oh, this person just shows up because the funder told them to show up. It was always done with like a really clear process of nominations and voting and selection before a person was invited, or choosing the co-chairs of working groups or steering committees. Same thing, done by, they really wanted a very democratic process. So they would have nominations and they would vote on those kinds of things. That was super important to them. Another one, this equity as a principle, I think could be really important to have as a stated goal. So I'm thinking of one particular education initiative where they had a goal of raising high school graduation rates by a certain percentage in a certain time. And one of the things they realized is they could achieve that goal by purely improving the rates of white and Asian students who already had the best outcomes. And so they had to say, in addition to our goal of raising the overall graduation rate among kids, we want to close the gap. That was one of the things they wanted to do. So they had that built into the sort of DNA of what their common agenda was, that this was an equity focus on African-American and Hispanic students, raising the graduation rates of those students as well. So I think that the values, these are some of the ones that we see sort of typically used, but I think they really depend on the community context and history as to what is going to be really valuable. So another one that's not on this list that was really helpful in the diabetes initiative was to be asset-based. They wanted to, sort of for similar historical reasons, they really wanted to make sure that rather than pointing out the challenges among, especially the Latino population with diabetes, that also the assets that that community has in terms of familismo and like other kinds of, other ways where that community has real strengths to work with, they really wanted to focus on those. So that was a big part in all their communications that they had with the working groups or the steering committee with the public to sort of bring asset-based language to how they did this work. So I think really depends on the context.
Great. Yeah. And this is definitely not a prescriptive list, but an illustrative set that, that resemble the types of things that we see steering committees of these types of initiatives in partnership with the backbone identifying for themselves. Certainly part of governance is considering what decision-making approaches make sense for the work. And there are lots of different frameworks or models for thinking about decision-making approaches. And I would say I don't see a super high level of consistency across collaboratives. So I don't think there is a single right answer to how decision-making processes are outlined. But I give this as kind of a pick list, if you will, to think about different approaches. And also to say that I think it's helpful to recognize that different kinds of decisions might need different decision-making approaches. And there might be different parts of the initiative that use different types of approaches. Like the steering committee might say that it is going to be consensus-based, but a work group can make that decision on its own. And they might say, like, for this, we feel like we need to have unanimity if we're going to move forward on something. And so just naming that the flexibility can exist like across the initiative. But the important thing is to be clear about what the decision-making process is that the group is going to use so that when faced with decisions, you have a process to fall back on. Abby, any color you want to add here?
Yeah, I would add, the one thing I would add is that I think the steering committee sort of, either they use team agreement or consensus for most of the times in the decisions, and people kind of get that. I think where I see the most confusion is between when there's working groups that start working on a particular issue, and then there tends to be a lot of ambiguity where the steering committee says, oh, that's the group that's making decisions on what we're going to do around screening. And sometimes the screening group can say, oh, are we proposing ideas that the steering committee then needs to approve for us to go forward with? So that would be the one construct I would say where there's the most kind of confusion around decision making is the respective roles of the steering committee and the working groups. So that's one that is probably worth paying attention to in addition to the decision making approaches within the steering committee or within the working group.
Yeah. And just to say a little bit more on that specifically, I would recommend, and this is my personal recommendation, and Abby, you can tell me if you've navigated this similarly, that that the steering committee sets like the general direction, like based on the landscape, based on the process that we've undergone and the input that we've gathered, we think screening is an important area of work. And then when the leaders of that work group come together, it is their decision because they are hopefully the experts on that topic to decide what kind of work they are going to take on, and that the steering committee doesn't have veto power over the direction that that group goes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think what the steering committee sort of can then serve a little bit the way a board serves a nonprofit in some ways, in the sense that they can, an ideal board they can provide some really helpful input on saying, hey, you all screening group might not have thought about this, but the other group is doing something really similar. You can tag along with them. Here's how you can use those resources. Here's some expertise we can offer, that kind of thing. So I've seen sort of presentations to the steering committee be really helpful to working groups, but not so much when they're more of an accountability or permission asking type of exercise. Yeah, so I would agree with you, Jen.
Great, thank you. Okay, just a couple more here. So in case it's helpful, this is more like just a reference or a checklist if you, not checklist, that feels too prescriptive, but a reference for types of things that could be helpful to have in sort of an overarching governance terms of reference document for the collaborative. So just coming to clarity on the range of things on this list and having those documented so that there's sort of like a single source where all of the governance processes and the direction of the initiative is captured. This certainly isn't the kind of thing that would exist on day one or maybe even, after 12 months, but as initiatives move forward, having these things kind of articulated and documented can be helpful and can certainly be helpful in times of transition of leadership, certainly of the backbone, but also as new folks are rolling onto or off of like a steering committee or the working groups, having things captured in one place. These are things that I think can always be helpful to have documented. And then the last thing is people often ask, like, what do we need MOUs around? Are they legally binding documents? How do you think about the role of MOUs? Often in collective impact initiatives, we see a lot of the work happening on the basis of trust and what I would call like informal partnership agreements where things are laid out clearly and it's helpful to document that, but they're not like legally binding documents that require legal intervention. The time when we do see something that is a little bit more formal can be when it comes to how funds will flow, or sometimes if there are like the example Abby gave about a backbone that might be sitting in two different organizations, being formal about documenting which part of the role is being housed in each of the organizations, and as a result, when funds come in, how much flow to each of the organizations. But above and beyond that, we don't tend to see a whole lot of legalese involved in the way documents come together, but more about using documents, even whether if you can even call it an MOU, as agreements of intent and to provide clarity amongst partners. Abby, anything you would add to that?
No, I think there's some like basic things that can be really helpful to get, like, just put down an agreement about what's the process for adding new members, or if someone doesn't attend for a long time, what's the process of sort of releasing members, or what's the, who hires and fires the backbone staff, which is usually the steering committee hires the backbone executive director. That executive director can hire their own staff, usually with input or approval from the steering committee. So those kinds of things, it's just helpful to put them down. They're not, and have a process before you run into a situation where you're dealing with them. Most of it, I haven't found this to be super hard for folks to make a decision about. It's, yeah, but it's helpful to have them, just as Jen said, for clarity, put them in writing.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I do want to be sure that we keep time for a couple more pieces and then a little bit more time for questions. So this last one, as Abby alluded to, we were calling sort of new ways of working. And what we want to really draw out here is less about sort of like the formal structures and roles and more about some of the mindsets and mindset shifts that this type of work requires for partners to embrace to move forward effectively. And I think the first thing is that it's important to name that these kinds of collaboratives themselves are complex systems and that you're operating within complex systems. And if you were working on simple problems, you would not need, or technical issues, you would not need to be bringing together this range of partners to pursue progress. And if you recognize that you're really working on complex issues, it's helpful to understand some of the characteristics that complex systems embody. And some of those characteristics are listed here. I myself am not a complexity scholar by any means, but I think that it's very helpful to understand that when you're working in complex systems, like the outcomes are not always predictable because the outcomes rely on the interrelationship and the connections between different parts of the system. And that it is really that you cannot have a central node of control. So we talk about the importance of the backbone, but I do worry sometimes it makes it sound like a hub and spoke type setup, when it's really the backbone kind of shepherding a complex system towards a goal versus pretending that the backbone has total control over the outcome that is being pursued. And in complex systems, things are going to naturally evolve and emerge when you're bringing together people who often don't work together, don't communicate, don't pursue projects together. You're going to learn new things, and you're going to be surprised by things that come out of those collaborations. And hopefully that is what the power is of bringing these partners together. But it does make the work a little bit less predictable, and is worth naming that ideally the work can evolve and follow that energy and that emergence. And that also sort of touches on the last point here, that things operate through co-evolution, that as things evolve, the initiative itself will evolve as part of that same complex system. And so I say this because we do often see groups coming together, and you have to come together around a certain issue. That's your starting point. But one of the skills of the backbone, and hopefully a mindset that can be embraced by the partners and the steering committee as well, is one that is embracing an acceptance of emergence and the recognition that things will probably evolve in a way that you didn't entirely suspect from day one. Abby, do you want to just say a little bit about like an example of things emerging?
Sure. I think I love this idea that oftentimes the way we're taught to work is we have sort of a predetermined solutions, and the rules of how we're going to interact with one another we'll figure out along the way. And I think collective impact is in many ways the opposite of that, where we make some decisions about how we're going to engage with one another, and that allows us to see solutions that we might not have otherwise. So one example of that is I've worked with a number of different groups that do some sort of formalized check-in process, like say the steering committee meeting is in a different location every month, and that organization gets to do a quick profile of their work and what they're doing, and that allows opportunities for partnership and engagement with that organization to bubble up. Another one I've seen is a 2-minute check-in, where at the beginning of a steering committee, they will have all or a portion of the group do a 2-minute overview of something that they're struggling with right now, or something that they have to offer right now to the group. And I remember one meeting where I saw one person in their 2-minute check-in say they were the head of an FQHC, and they said, we just lost the person that's our diabetes coordinator. We used to have sort of group classes and, providing nutrition and things like that. We've cut our funding, so we have all of our diabetics or pre-diabetics without any lifestyle support classes. The same time, in the same check-in, someone from the YMCA, this is in a different region, said, the YMCA just got national approval to start being a pilot program for the diabetes prevention program, and we're looking to recruit folks. And so of course those two women looked at each other and went, okay, you and me were talking after this meeting, because I've got a whole bunch of patients who just lost a service, and I have a service and no patients. And those kinds of things I think can percolate often, and sort of giving value to the unexpected things that can come up along the way. And sometimes those are the most valuable connections that can be made, or the things you never would have predicted. But having processes like a 2-minute check-in can help you have the discipline to find those opportunities.
Nice. That's a great example. Great. So the last thing that we wanted to put up on the screen was what we tend to call mindset shifts. And I think on the left are the things that are often the way that we go about our day-to-day jobs, and or our mental models that have been ingrained in us by the way that social change has historically been pursued in our communities. And on the right are the encouragement for new ways of working that can really help foster and underscore the importance of working collaboratively with partners from different perspectives. And so I'm not going to go through all of them, But I want to spend a minute on the second one. So I think in these processes, often when we're trying to think about what to do on a certain topic or a certain issue, be that diabetes or immigration or cardiovascular disease or whatever it is, we think about who are the content experts on this topic that we need to bring to the table. And we're really used to doing that. And what we would encourage in a new way of working is thinking about context expertise as equally valued. And by context expertise, I mean the voice of residents, the voice of people with lived experience that have the context to understand what they are facing in their own lives on a day-to-day basis. And that marrying those two perspectives is really, really important, and not only relying on content expertise. And the other one that I will mention, which I think is part and parcel of even coming together to work as a collaborative, is moving from the expectation that we're going to find like the magic answer to this issue to saying, we recognize there are a broad range of interventions that are going to be needed, all to come together and contribute in lots of many different ways if we're going to see the big picture progress that we want to see. And many of the examples that Abby has given from the diabetes work are those nuggets that add up to really seeing change across the system. It wasn't a single magic program, but rather the contribution of many different things. Those are, and there's some others here, but those are the two I just wanted to say a little bit about. So with that, I want to give a minute for another question or two if anything is coming up for folks. Or Sue, if there's anything that you want to call on us to share in our final few minutes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad to hear you say the check-in, because we always do check-in questions. And so I do think it provides an opportunity for sharing and learning. And I think that was one thing. And then I think one of the other things we've encouraged people to do, and I think a couple of the sites are doing it, is embedding this notion of reflection in your agendas, because you are all working in complexity. Taking the time to stop and think about what have you actually learned and done together. And I think particularly in this last piece around the new ways of working is really an important piece. And I think the backbone serving in that role, really to kind of help to facilitate that, is really important. So thank you.
Great. I'll open the floor for another question if anyone has one. And also, Sue, you can definitely feel free to give out or I'll say mine. I have my email address if anyone's interested in following up offline.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. Yeah, we will. I'm not sure if I have the most current slides, but we'll post the slides and the recording, and then you had some pre-information at that as well.
Great. Yeah, so maybe we should wrap with that then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if anybody has any particular questions. Just love to hear any closing comments if this was helpful. Sue, I can see you. Everyone else has their camera off.
So yeah, it was very, very helpful. I appreciate this. And I'm gonna, once I get the recording, I'm gonna send it to our core team. I think it'll be valuable for them to listen to and just kind of, solidify our identity, and the role that the backbone plays with the steering committee and the work groups. And, we're kind of always revising or looking at that. And I don't think we've landed on something yet, but I think this can inform, and whether we integrate it right now or we do it later when we review our charter in a year, there's just always room for improvement.
Great. Always learning, right? So great. Any last comments from anyone?
I will just say thank you for the invitation to join you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very grateful. Lots of wisdom, right, in all of this. So great.
Agreed. Many thanks.
Thank you all.
Okay. And thanks for all the work that you do.
Yes, thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.